We're the History Detectives, and we're going to investigate some untold stories from America's past.
This week, did this old brass cannon ignite the first battle of the Revolutionary War?
Is this riding crop a reminder of a brutal beating that took place on the floor of the Senate?
And was this New York townhouse where John Wilkes Booth hatched his plot to kill Abraham Lincoln?
Watch the detectives. Get so angry when the teardrops start, but you can't move it 'cause you got no heart. Watch the detectives. It's just like watching the detectives.
This program was made possible by contributions to local PBS stations by viewers like you. Thank you.
Our first story offers a unique insight into a political attack that polarized the nation. In the 1850s, the country is divided from north to south over one issue: slavery. On May 19, 1856, an abolitionist senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner, stands up in Congress and gives a two-day speech attacking the pro-slavery movement. When it's over, he's approached by South Carolina Representative Preston Brooks. Brooks raises his wooden walking cane into the air and brings it crashing down on Sumner's head. He continues to beat Sumner until he is finally dragged away. Sumner lies on the floor of the House bleeding and badly injured, the victim of the most vicious and bloody act Congress has ever witnessed. Over 140 years later, a man has a riding crop he thinks the future president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, gave Preston Brooks in support of that William Bonham is the great-great-great-grandson of Brooks, and the crop has been passed down from generation to generation.
The riding crop is actually one of the few gifts Preston Brooks received that the family has kept. I can only imagine it must have come from somebody pretty significant. This incredibly beautiful handcrafted item was a gift to celebrate a violently cruel act.
I'm Tukufu Zuberi, and I've come to Long Island, New York to meet William and check out the crop.
Wow. Well, it's pretty interesting. A little bit worn down here, but the handle appears to be gold. So do you think this has ever been used?
It looks like it has, but I think it's just frayed from age, actually. I believe that it was probably an ornamental piece.
So what would you like to know about it?
I'm interested in where it really came from. As you can see, there's an inscription on the top that says, P.S. Brooks from J.E. Davis, Columbus, Georgia, it says in the middle. What I would like to know is if J.E. Davis is in fact Jefferson Davis, and if this riding crop was given to my ancestor, Preston Brooks, as a gift of support for the Brooks-Sumner caning affair.
Jefferson Davis. He's a pretty significant historical figure.
I'd say so.
But why do you think it would have anything to do with the caning incident?
Well, there's an inscription on the handle, as you can see. It reads, a whip for the horse, a bridle for the ass, and a rod for the fool's back. Proverbs 26 chapter 3rd verse.
Like a rod for the fool's back, referring to Sumner?
I guess that's the interpretation.
Do you know if Jefferson Davis actually knew Preston Brooks?
I know that my great-great-great-grandfather, Millard Bonham, had personal contact with Jefferson Davis during the war. I thought that there might be some connection, but I really don't have any concrete proof. So it's been a real mystery.
I'm going to do my best, see what I can find out, and get an answer back to you as soon as I can. How about that?
Thanks a lot,
All
Tukufu.
right.
William tells me he knows the riding crop's provenance, its chain of custody. So there seems to be no doubt about its authenticity.
However, I am troubled by at least a couple of things. One, it says here, from J.E. Davis.
I seem to remember Jefferson Davis's middle initial was an F.
And if you're going to give someone a gift to support their involvement in the caning incident, why give them a riding crop? Why not give them a replacement cane?
By the time the caning incident took place in the mid-1850s, the debate about slavery was reaching fever pitch. New territories in the expanding United States lay above the boundary line drawn in the Missouri Compromise of 1820. According to that legislation, no land above the line was supposed to be open to slavery. But in 1854, Congress repealed the ban in order to appease the angry advocates of slavery. The Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed white settlers to decide for themselves whether or not slavery should be permitted in these new territories. This led to 2 years of guerrilla warfare in one of the states, Kansas, and bitter debate in Congress over its future. It was in this climate that Senator Sumner began his impassioned speech in defense of a slave-free Kansas that so infuriated Preston Brooks. I've come to Bronx Community College to meet historian and expert on the caning incident, Lloyd Benson.
In May of 1856, Sumner gets up and he gives a 2-day speech. They love to talk back then. 2 days. Sumner gives frequent reference to the language of a pure woman who has been violated. Kansas is a woman who has been raped by the slave power and by a president who stood by and watched it happen. But along the way, he makes a side comment. Who else helps the president out? And the person that he singles out is Senator Andrew Pickens Butler of South Carolina. This is where it connects to Brooks. Brooks is Butler's cousin.
Okay.
He's a member of Congress. He's in the audience. And he hears this insult, and he becomes increasingly enraged by it. He walks up to Sumner at his desk. He says, "You have insulted Mr. Butler, who is a relative of mine, and have insulted the honor of my state." He pulls out a cane, and he hits him about 30 good times over his head and his back.
Pretty savage beating.
A savage beating. And he hits him so hard that the cane shatters into many different pieces. And Sumner collapses into a bloody heap on the floor of the Senate chamber. He's out of commission for more than 2 years.
And Brooks?
Brooks becomes a hero in the South. He goes from being a relatively unknown congressman to a person that some people in the South talk about as a possible presidential candidate. This becomes one of the 4 or 5 most important things leading up to the Civil War, one of the really key incidents that helped drive Northerners and Southerners even further apart.
What will Lloyd make of our riding crop? Could it have been a gift in support of Preston Brooks' actions?
Brooks received many gifts from a variety of different people. He gets silver goblets, loving cups, plaques, and other kinds of artifacts.
So were riding crops ever given as gifts?
It certainly seems consistent with the other kinds of gifts that he received. It wouldn't surprise me that he received a riding crop, not at all. A whip for the horse, a bridle for the ass, and a rod for the fool's back. This last phrase is pretty clearly about Sumner.
So our crop does seem to be connected to the caning incident. I tell Lloyd it's one of the few things the family's kept all these years.
If they kept it, it must have had some really important meaning to the Brooks family. Whoever sent this must have been somebody who had some connection with the family or who the family really thought highly of.
Maybe I was wrong. Perhaps the crop was a gift from Jefferson Davis after all. To be certain, I've come to Queens Library to check out their collection of Jefferson Davis's papers. And look at this, a letter from Jefferson Davis to the citizens of Edgefield. That was Preston Brooks's hometown. Davis appears to be turning down an invite to a dinner, one of many the town was holding in Brooks's honor.
But listen to what he says about our guy Brooks, a representative whom I hold in such high regard and esteem. Okay, and he goes on, who has been the subject of vilification, misrepresentation, and persecution because he resented a libelous assault upon the reputation of their mother. Okay, referring to South Carolina.
So Davis definitely supported Brooks's action, but did he give him a gift? One clue is the reference to Columbus, Georgia, on the crop.
This is a chronology of Jefferson Davis's life. And it says here he was born in Kentucky and grew up in Mississippi. But there's no reference to him ever living in Columbus, Georgia, or Georgia at all.
And look at the signature on this letter, J.F. Davis, not J.E. Davis. Just as I suspected, there is a problem. In fact, nothing on the crop checks out with what we know about the President of the Confederacy. But if J.E. Davis isn't Jefferson Davis, who is he? To find out, I've come to the place mentioned on the cane, Columbus, Georgia. Historian Ken Thomas is helping me go through census records at the Columbus State University archives. Columbus sits right on the Georgia-Alabama border, so we're checking census records for both states. There's no J.E. Davis here in 1850. What about 1860? Okay, here's a J.E. Davis from Russell County, just across the river from Columbus.
So let's look him up.
This microfilm holds all the 1860 census records for Russell County.
Aha, Johnny Davis.
Yes. So who was he?
He's 47 years old.
47-year-old.
He's a merchant, and he's born in New York.
By looking through the town records, we discover that John E. Davis's middle name was Ayers, and he died on August 19, 1864. To confirm it's our guy, we check local newspapers for an obituary.
1864, the Daily Columbus Inquirer. Let's take it in the other room and let's have a look. And of course, this paper's 140 years old and it's held up pretty well.
Oh, look at this.
On August 21st, 1864, there's an invitation to John E. Davis's funeral.
All members of the old Columbus Guards now in this city are invited to meet at the Masonic Hall this morning in order to attend the funeral of Major John E. Davis. The old Columbus Guards, that was a group that formed up here in the 1830s, and then they also fought in the Mexican War in the 1840s.
I know the old Columbus Guard went on to fight for the Confederacy in the Civil War, which suggests that, like Preston Brooks, John Davis supported the slave system. This would explain why Davis sent the crop, but not why Brooks held on to it. What else is there? Now that I know his middle name is Ayers, I can check out his full name on the internet. And I get a surprising result. A full page of links to the filibustering movement, private military expeditions that illegally invaded nations that weren't at war with the states. In the 1850s, these expeditions invaded Caribbean countries like Cuba and Nicaragua in the hope of turning them into new U.S. slave states. It's a long shot, but could this be how John Davis and Preston Brooks were connected? To find out, I've come to the Columbus Museum to meet Professor Anthony Della Cova, author of a book on the subject. First, he shows me evidence of John Davis's filibustering.
I have a letter here that indicates that he was involved to a great extent in the filibuster movement.
In this letter from a Captain Gonzalez to the future president of the Republic of Texas, John E. Davis is recommended as an important filibustering contact in Columbus, Georgia.
So this is our guy, Captain Davis.
Yeah.
This is him. That's pretty good. Okay. Now, have you heard of Preston Brooks being part of the filibuster movement?
Preston Brooks was not part of the filibuster movement in the sense that he was publicly identified with it. Was something that they would not publicly admit to. But Preston Brooks definitely sympathized with their cause, and he had relatives such as Milledge Bonham that did support the filibusters.
Milledge Bonham? That was William's other great-great-great-grandfather. and Preston Brooks' cousin. So this could be the connection, but I need something more convincing. I've returned to the Columbus State University archive, where I'm cross-referencing all my collected information to see if there's any other links. According to the U.S. Congress Biographical Directory, Brooks fought in the Mexican War in the Palmetto Regiment. I know J.E. Davis fought in that war too. And in this book on the Mexican War, there's a picture of him. But I know he was in the old Columbus Guard, so Brooks and Davis served in different regiments. Maybe there's some other military connection between them. This microfilm contains a description of the Mexican War. And here's something that could explain why Preston Brooks kept a riding crop given to him by John E. Davis.
Oh, I'm a good old rebel, now that's just what I am.
I'm heading back to Long Island to tell William everything I've discovered, starting with the fact that the crop wasn't a gift from Jefferson Davis.
It's a little disappointing because I sort of thought I had the story wrapped up, but not a very good history detective myself. But it does make me actually curious as to who it was that gave it to him.
Well, that made me curious as well. Why did your family keep this riding crop?
I tell William about my discovery at the Columbus State University archives. Preston Brooks and John Davis did serve in the Mexican War in different regiments, but they were under the command of the same general, John Quitman. So it's more than likely they fought alongside each other, which is probably why Brooks kept this gift from Davis.
Okay, so that's the connection. Makes me feel good to finally resolve this question. It's been a true mystery solved. Well, to Khufu, I have to thank you immensely for your great work.
Well, it's been my pleasure.
Preston Brooks died in 1857 at the age of 38, only 1 year after the caning incident. Ironically, he never lived to see the long-range consequences of his actions, the defeat of the Confederacy and the ending of slavery in his beloved South Carolina.
What led to the outbreak of the bloodiest conflict in the history of North America? A common explanation is that the Civil War was fought over the moral issue of slavery. In fact, it was the economics of slavery and political control of that system that was central to the conflict. A key issue was states' rights. The Southern states wanted to assert their authority over the federal government so they could abolish federal laws they didn't support, especially laws interfering with the South's right to keep slaves and take them wherever they wished. Another factor was territorial expansion. The South wished to take slavery into the Western territories, while the North was committed to keeping them open to white labor alone. Meanwhile, the newly formed Republican Party, whose members were strongly opposed to the westward expansion of slavery into new states, was gaining prominence. The election of a Republican, Abraham Lincoln, as president in 1860 sealed the deal. His victory, without a single Southern electoral vote, was a clear signal to the Southern states they had lost all influence. Feeling excluded from the political system, they turned to the only alternative they believed was left to them: secession. A political decision that led directly to war. To find out more, log on to History Detectives on the web at pbs.org.
Our next story exposes new details about the most insidious conspiracy in U.S. history. April 14th, 1865. An actor enters a popular theater in our nation's capital. Quietly, he makes his way upstairs to the private boxes. At 10:15 p.m., during the third act of Our American Cousin, John Wilkes Booth fires a single bullet into the head of the President of the United States, committing one of the most infamous assassinations in American history. Nearly 140 years later, a woman in downtown New York City believes that the plot to assassinate Abraham Lincoln may have begun in her building. Jean Deerking is a school teacher here.
If I were to find out that the plot to assassinate Abraham Lincoln actually took place here, I think I would feel very mixed about it. I would be excited that a historical event of this magnitude took place here. However, this event was so tragic, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, it would be a bit powerful also.
I'm Gwen Wright, and I'm here in New York City to meet Jean and investigate the story. So, Jean, what have you heard about this house?
Well, living in the Village, I've heard lots of different rumors about this building in particular. I've heard that this was the house of a mayor. I've heard that it was a stop on the Underground Railroad. I've heard that it was a French hospital. The thing that I'm really most intrigued and interested in finding out is whether or not John Wilkes Booth conspired right here in this building to assassinate Abraham Lincoln.
Where did you hear the story?
I've heard it from several different sources. I've heard walking tours say this again and again. This is a stop on every walking tour, you name it. Everything from the history of Greenwich Village to the ghosts of Greenwich Village. And I would just be so interested to find out whether or not it's true.
I think I can find out for you whether or not that happened.
That would be great. It would be so exciting.
After Booth shot Lincoln, he leapt onto the stage, breaking his leg. But he still managed to escape, first to Maryland, then to Virginia. He eluded authorities for 12 days before being tracked down and killed in a shootout. Of his known co-conspirators, 4 were hanged and 3 others were sentenced to hard labor for life. We all know that Lincoln was assassinated in Ford's Theater. But if Jean's story is true, then the plot was put into motion not in Washington, D.C., but right here at 45 Grove Street in New York City. The first thing I need to know is whether or not Jean's building was even here at the time John Wilkes Booth was plotting to kill Lincoln.
There's several ways I could date this house. The plainness is itself a giveaway. This late Federal style tended to be quite reserved. Some ornamentation was in the use of bricks, what's called Flemish bond, alternating long, short, long, short. This arched doorway set into the house, it's not a large porch, is also characteristic of that era, and so are the lintels above the windows.
All these details help me date Jean's building to the late 1820s or around 1830. So there's one thing I'm sure of.
This house was here when John Wilkes Booth was plotting Lincoln's assassination.
What was John Wilkes Booth doing here? We don't immediately associate a northern stronghold like New York with radical Southern politics. Were attitudes here in line with Booth's pro-Confederate sympathies? I'm going to meet my colleague, Columbia University professor Eric Foner, to find out more about New York City during the Civil War.
We shouldn't think of the Civil War as a fight between a moral North and an immoral South. Slavery was a terrible crime, obviously, but the North also was riddled with racism. On the eve of the Civil War, or right when secession is taking place, the mayor of New York, Fernando Wood, who was a Democrat, proposed that New York also secede from the Union, not to join the Confederacy, but to become a kind of free city, so that it could trade freely with North and South and become just its own little entity. This didn't happen, of course, but it shows you how closely tied in New York was with the cotton economy and how petrified the leaders of New York were about the prospect of losing that connection with the slave South. New York financiers financed the cotton. New York insurance agencies insured slavery and slave ships. Many New Yorkers, longshoremen, shipbuilders, merchants, etc., had their livelihoods depended on the strength of the Southern economy. So that's one of the reasons that there is a lot of pro-Southern sentiment in this city.
So, Eric, Booth could easily have felt that he could find supporters for his cause in New York City.
It's hard to think of a city in the North that Booth would have thought it was likely to find Southern sympathizers more strongly than in New York City.
So, as odd as it sounds, the climate in New York was right for Booth to hatch his conspiracy here. But what link could there have been between John Wilkes Booth and 45 Grove Street? I'm checking with New York City's Landmarks Preservation Commission to see if historical records of Jean's building mention Booth.
Thank you. Here's the report. Great. This is a report that the Landmarks Commission put together listing all of the houses in the Greenwich Village Historic District. So ours should be here. Let's see. Well, here's Grove Street. Here we have 45 Grove. A full page of description. This magnificent house was once a freestanding mansion surrounded by spacious grounds. It's described here as undoubtedly one of the finest and largest federal residences in Greenwich Village.
Booth was a stage actor, so it's doubtful he could have afforded a mansion like this. But wait, around 1850, there seemed to have been some major changes to 45 Grove Street.
The property sold in 1851 for development. It's reclassified from a first-class to a second-class resident, which means there were commercial properties on the basement and parlor floor, and I would expect that much of this was rented out.
This makes sense given the history of Greenwich Village. By the 1860s, many mansions like 45 Grove had been converted into boarding houses. Maybe Booth came to town for theater work and rented a room in Jean's building. I'm meeting with Richard Sloan of the Lincoln Group of New York to see if Booth ever appeared on the New York stage.
Richard, was John Wilkes Booth the proverbial itinerant actor? Would he have left Washington and come to perform in New York?
Oh, yes, he did on a couple of occasions that I know of, once in Brooklyn and once in November of 1864. He and his brothers, Edwin Booth, the famous Shakespearean actor, and their brother, Junius Brutus Booth, Jr., they performed here in a special production of Julius Caesar at the Winter Garden Theater. It's just a couple of blocks from here. In fact, I have a copy of the program here.
Fascinating. 3 Booth brothers in Julius Caesar. How strangely appropriate, a play about intrigue and assassination. Just 6 months before Booth assassinates Lincoln. I'm trying to tie Booth to a specific address, 45 Grove Street. Do you know it?
I know 45 Grove Street.
Yes.
Yeah, that was a house that an actor friend of John Wilkes Booth lived in the late 1860s. His name was Samuel K. Chester.
Samuel Chester, I haven't heard his name.
Oh, he was a boyhood friend of John Wilkes Booth's, going back to Baltimore in the 1840s. And they started their careers together in the theater in Richmond, Virginia, at the Richmond Theater around 1858.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
That may have been an involvement.
And in that performance of Julius Caesar with the 3 Booth brothers, Sam Chester is actually in the cast. He supported them. He's listed as C.K. Chester for some reason, but that's him. That's Sam Chester.
Could Chester be the missing link? Could he have helped plot Lincoln's assassination? I'm heading to the National Archives in Maryland, where the records from the investigation into Lincoln's assassination are kept. Here we have a summary of testimony concerning the following persons confined in Old Capitol Prison and supposed to be implicated in or to have had knowledge of the assassination of the president. Captain Samuel Cox, Samuel K. Chester. So Chester is on this list. These are the original handwritten documents from May 1865. And here's Samuel Chester's statement. I live in New York. I'm an actor, have known John Wilkes Booth. I was on terms of close friendship with him. Chester goes on to describe his friend Booth coming to visit him in New York City. I lived then in another part of the city at 45 Grove Street near Bleecker. Here in Jean's building, Booth visits Chester late in 1864. According to Chester, they leave 45 Grove Street for a walk through Greenwich Village. They head south to a local tavern. I went with him to the House of Lords on Houston Street to drink with him. We drank considerably.
They leave the House of Lords and walk up Broadway. Booth wants to talk to Chester about a speculation or plan, but he won't reveal what it is. This is the speculation that I am concerned in. There is an immense party connected with it. Booth is being very secretive and quite nervous, meandering with Chester along what was back then a very quiet street in the village. They finally stop near Washington Square Park, and Booth reveals the elaborate plot he's been concocting. It's a conspiracy to bring down the Union and give a victory to the Confederacy. And Booth wants Chester to help. It is a conspiracy against the government to capture the heads of the government at Washington and carry them to Richmond, including Mr. Lincoln, to Richmond, Virginia, capital of the Confederacy.
This isn't what I was expecting. This isn't a plot to assassinate Lincoln, but to capture him. But would Samuel Chester go along with it?
Chester protests and says, "No, John, I can't have anything to do with anything of that kind." Booth offers him $3,000 to $4,000. Chester won't do it. Booth then threatens him and says, "I carry a derringer loaded to shoot every one that betrays me." Chester is still resistant. According to Chester's statement, they then part company. Booth heads back to Maryland, but keeps writing Chester, asking him to join the conspiracy. Chester is unwavering. I wrote to him, imploring him to give up this wild idea. Booth came to New York after that, and he told me that he had given up this idea, that the affair had fallen through.
But that wasn't the case. John Wilkes Booth and Samuel Chester would meet one last time.
Just 1 week before the assassination, Booth again visits Chester in New York City. They go out, and Chester reports, "Finally, he slapped his hand upon the table and said, 'What a splendid chance I had to kill the president.'" He was right next to him on the stand at the inauguration. He didn't do anything, but clearly Booth is still obsessed with the idea of harming the president.
As we all know, on that fateful night in 1865, in front of a packed Ford's Theater, Booth acted on his murderous obsession with the president. It's time to tell Jean everything I've learned about her house. That the assassination plot wasn't hatched here.
Okay, that's a relief.
In fact, the man who lived here tried to stop it.
It was a man named Samuel Chester, who was an actor and a close friend of Booth's. And Booth told him about a plot that originally was going to be one to kidnap the president and other heads of state.
Really?
Yes, Chester told him he wouldn't join the plan and tried to dissuade Booth from doing anything.
I feel relieved. It's nice to know that something that terrible didn't happen here.
Samuel Chester continued his acting career and lived in New York City until his death in 1921. If he had been able to convince his friend John Wilkes Booth to change his mind, there's no doubt that the history of the United States would have been dramatically altered.
Whose job is it to protect the president? Well, before the Secret Service, it was sometimes the Army, sometimes the local police, but lots of times it was no one. Tom Jefferson walked to his own inauguration unguarded. Martin Van Buren walked to church on Sundays alone. Before Lincoln, the only serious attempt to kill a president was a would-be assassin who fired 2 shots at Andrew Jackson. He missed. But even after that, presidential protection remained at best sporadic. On the night Lincoln was assassinated, a local Washington patrolman had been assigned to protect the president, but he abandoned his post to get a better view of the play. The Secret Service was created 4 months after Lincoln's assassination, not to protect the president, but to protect the economy. Its agents were charged with fighting counterfeiting. At the time, over 1/3 of the paper currency in the United States was counterfeit. 2 more presidents would be assassinated before presidential protection became a full-time national priority. One gunman killed President Garfield at a Washington train station in 1881, and another gunman shot President McKinley at the Pan Am Expo in Buffalo in 1901. After 3 assassinations in less than 40 years, Congress finally assigned the Secret Service responsibility for the safety of the president at all times. Today, the duties of the Secret Service include protecting the president, vice president, future presidents, past presidents, presidential families, visiting heads of states, and other distinguished foreign visitors. They still continue to fight counterfeiting, as well as credit card, telemarketing, and cell phone fraud. In other words, they stay busy. To find out more, visit History Detectives on the web at pbs.org.
Our last investigation could provide new details about the incendiary events that ignited the Revolutionary War. It's April 1775, a time of growing dissent in Britain's North American colonies. To disarm suspected rebels, the British governor of Massachusetts orders 800 redcoats to march on Concord, a known anti-British stronghold. By the time the army arrives, the rebels have assembled. The sides converge on the famous North Bridge, and shots are fired. The first battle of the Revolutionary War has begun. Almost 230 years later, we've heard a story about an old brass cannon that, if true, could reveal unexpected details about those momentous events. The cannon, claimed to date back to the Revolutionary War, was recently rediscovered by the National Park Service. The find especially intrigued Kate Barrett from Boston. She has a personal connection with the start of the conflict.
My ancestor, Colonel James Barrett, was commander of the rebel forces in Concord on April 19, 1775.
Kate also knows an old family legend that claims the real reason redcoats marched on Concord was to retrieve a brass cannon stolen from the British in Boston and hidden on her ancestor's farm. Could the cannon discovered by the Park Service be the one featured in our family's story? And if it is, did the search for it really ignite the Revolutionary War?
I've never seen it, but I've heard lots of stories about it, and I'd like to know if the stories are true.
I'm Elise LeRae, and I've come to Boston to investigate. The first thing I want to do is show Kate the cannon, which is now stored at the Charleston Navy Yard. Here it is.
Wow.
This is the cannon.
It's the one I heard about?
Yep. What do you think?
I think it's incredibly old, but very neat.
So, Kate, tell me, what do you want to know?
I'd like to know if the cannons were the real motivation for the British march on Concord, and if this is one of the cannons.
Well, that would certainly make this one important cannon.
Yes, it would, yeah. Be great to know for sure.
Do you know anything else about it? Anything else I can go on?
I don't. That's all I've heard.
Well, I have to be honest. It sounds a little far-fetched, but I'll check it out.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much, Elise.
If this story is true, this could be one of the most important pieces we've ever investigated. You know, I've sold a lot of arms and armor before, but I've never sold a cannon, and it looks old, it looks period. And there's an inscription. It says, possessed by the British colonies of Massachusetts at the commencement of the war on the 19th of April, 1775. It gives me a time frame, but I don't always trust inscriptions, so I think this is going to be a tough one. I need to confirm the cannon's age, but first I want to do some background research. And I found a number of books retelling the popular history. Here's what they have to say. In the colonies, attitudes had become polarized during 1774, and Massachusetts was the eye of the storm. The British Army had occupied Boston, from where they tried to control the colony. But the colonists refused to surrender their power, and resistance grew, with many militiamen, the People's Army, taking up the rebel cause. And Concord became a base for their operations. In an attempt to neutralize the opposition, the British Army General and Governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Gage, ordered his troops to confront them. But spies learned of the plans, and Paul Revere and 2 other riders were dispatched to alert the populace. By the time the British troops had marched the 20 miles from Boston to Concord, the rebels were ready for them. The Redcoats were forced to retreat, but had to run a rebel gauntlet. Snipers attacked the troops from behind stone walls, trees, barns, and houses. By the end of the day, nearly 300 Redcoats and 100 colonists lay dead. Massachusetts was at war with Great Britain, and the rebel success had inspired the spirit of revolution across all the American colonies. But I don't see any mention here of a theft of a cannon. I wonder if the cannon itself might hold some clues. I'm meeting cannon expert Chris Fox from Fort Ticonderoga, New York, to learn about the cannon and whether it could even have been around in the late 18th century.
Cannons were produced beginning in the 14th century. The first cannons were a lot simpler than this gun here. They were simply bars of iron that were held together by rings, and everything was just welded together to make a tube, basically, from which a cannonball could be fired.
According to Chris, cannons were widely used in North America as far back as the French and Indian War of the 1750s, to devastating effect, pulverizing fortifications and wiping out entire lines with a single volley of buckshot. Let's get back to our cannon.
First of all, it's a brass cannon.
Brass cannons were lighter and more durable than older-style iron cannons. You know, I noticed that there was some type of design here. What do you make of this?
Yeah, there's a remnant of a seal or a coat of arms of some sort. You know, what it was, it's hard to say.
Perhaps the size and shape of the cannon can tell Chris more about it. First, he checks out the caliber. It seems to be a 4-pounder, meaning it fired cannonballs weighing 4 pounds. But what about the date?
In terms of dating, you know, we would often look at the ring, the base ring here. And on the base ring, very often you'll find a maker's mark or inscription and a date. And this lacks that.
This missing mark suggests to Chris that the cannon wasn't made for the British Army, but perhaps imported from Britain for use by the local militia. Then he spots something else.
One thing I notice is at the back end or the breech of the gun, there's a set of rings here. And this is the point where an elevating screw is attached to it for raising and lowering it, for aiming it. And that's a trait that is seen on British cannon beginning in the late 1750s. Take all this together, it seems to suggest to me a date of around 1760 or the mid-1760s.
So would it have been in use just before the Revolutionary War?
Yes, it certainly would have been in use before the Revolution and right up through the war, no doubt.
So we know the cannon is from the right period and would have been a nice addition to any arsenal. But what about the alleged theft? Kate thinks the stolen cannons were chased to Concord. So that's where I've come, to meet historian and park ranger Jim Hollister, who's an expert on events leading up to the battle. Jim, I'm trying to find out about a theft of cannons by the rebels in Boston in the 1770s. Have you heard about it?
Yes, I have. Some cannons were taken in September of 1774, just as events were starting to spiral out of control.
There was a theft.
Yes, there was.
Jim explains that rebels raided several forts and armories across Massachusetts. But their most audacious theft was from Major Adino Paddock's artillery arm of the Boston militia. That's the theft.
Our theft. That was it.
So what happened?
Some rebels had broken into the gun houses and stole 2 brass cannons right off from the noses of the British soldiers that were standing guard. And soon after, when one of the British officers discovered that the guns were taken, he said, "By God, the guns are gone. I'll be damned if these people won't steal the teeth out of your head while you're watching."
So a brass cannon was stolen from the militia, which fits our story perfectly.
It was very important, both symbolically as well as strategically. A lot of the cannons that the colonists had been stockpiling were old, heavy iron guns. Really not much use for an army in the field. What they needed were lighter cannons, and that's exactly what these were.
Losing these cannons would have infuriated the British governor, Thomas Gage. He must have wanted them back. But is that why he sent troops to Concord? First, I need to find out if the stolen cannons were even there. I'm headed to the Massachusetts Historical Society, which has one of the best collections of documents and accounts from 18th century Boston.
Hi, here's the material you requested.
Thank you. Here are copies of some of Gage's correspondence. Some of the pages are in French, and I've had them translated. They are intelligence reports, and were probably written in French to hide their contents. This is interesting. This is from a royal spy in Worcester, Massachusetts, another place where rebels had arms. And it says here, the brass cannons, which were once in Mr. Paddock's hands, never got here and are probably presently in Concord. This is huge. Jim told us the stolen cannons had belonged to Paddock's group of the militia, so they really were in Concord, and Gage knew it. But did he send troops there specifically for the cannons? I think I may have found our answer. This is a copy of Gage's marching orders to seize weapons in Concord. 4 brass cannon and 2 mortars with a number of smaller arms in the cellar or outhouse of Mr. Barrett. So they were marching to Kate's ancestors' farm in Concord, and the cannons were on the top of the list. But wait, it's only a draft. I found the orders that were actually given, and they're a bit different. He puts ammunition and provisions before cannons. So we can't say the stolen cannons were the only motivation for the march, but they were there, and they were on Gage's mind. But was our cannon one of them? I'm going to see if I can find any other records that might give us a description of the cannons that were stolen and taken to Concord. Apart from Gage's papers, I can't find any mention of brass cannons. But wait a second, I think I found something. Here's a mention of cannons coming in from London in the Boston Gazette from 1768. In the Brigantine Abigail, from London, came 2 beautiful brass field pieces, 3-pounders. Wait a minute. Chris said ours was a 4-pounder. Could the newspaper have gotten it wrong? Let's see if there's anything else. With province arms thereon for the use of the train of artillery of the regiment of this town, Boston. So these are cannons for the Boston Militia Artillery, Paddock's artillery. They must be the stolen cannons, and now we have a physical description. They have a Massachusetts coat of arms. And our cannon definitely had a remnant of a coat of arms or seal. I need to find out what the Massachusetts coat of arms would have looked like back then. Here it is. Now I want to see what Chris thinks. Listen, I think I found something. Can you meet me back at the cannon? Okay, see you there. Thanks. The first thing I ask him is about the newspaper article.
The thing about newspaper articles, particularly those from the 18th century, is that very often the information in them is inaccurate. And if the person writing the article didn't know the difference, the slight difference between a 3- and 4-pounder, they may have gotten it wrong. Well, I think what we need to do here is take a look at the seal. It would be very unusual for a cannon, apart from, say, a British military piece, to have some sort of elaborate seal.
Chris thinks if we can match the seals, then we got our stolen cannon. I don't really think we're going to be able to do that.
Yeah, it's pretty well worn flat.
It's completely worn. I was about to give up when I thought of one more thing. The cannon that this would have come over from London with. Why don't we try and find the pair? If we can find the correct seal on the twin cannon, then we can assume our cannon had the seal as well. And Chris has a surprise for me. He's done some research on his own, and he thinks he knows where the twin cannon is.
This gun's twin.
Oh, good. Let's go. Bunker Hill was one of the earliest and bloodiest battles of the American Revolution. There is now a towering monument here, and if Chris is correct, the twin cannon could be in it, 294 steps high. Wow, look at this. Ah, there it is. All right, let's check out that seal. That's it.
I could see mistaking the caliber of the gun, but that's the seal, and there's really no mistaking that. Let me take some measurements so that we compare this with the other gun to make sure they are in fact a pair. We're looking for about 42 inches.
These results are going to be a real surprise for Kate. I can't wait to tell her what I found, that a theft did occur and a retrieval of cannons does seem to have been behind the British Army's march to Concord.
No way. Oh my God. I had no idea. That's great news.
As for your other question, was our cannon one of the ones that were stolen? I think I have your answer. The bore diameter should be just over 3 1/8. What do we have?
Just over 3 1/8.
Yes. This last one will be the clincher if it's 20.5.
20.5 inches right there. So I'd say we have a match.
Just what I wanted to hear. If you take that with all the other evidence combined, I think I can make a strong enough case that these cannons were at Concord in April 1775.
Wow, that's cool. Oh, that's great. A whole new part of the family history.
There's more. I have a surprise for you.
Oh.
But you have to follow me. Okay, are you ready? We're going to teach you how to fire this replica 18th century brass cannon.
You gotta be kidding me.
Nope. You ready?
So I'm just gonna be lighting it.
You're gonna be lighting
Okay.
Kate, before we fire this, every one of us on the crew wears a medal of St. Barbara.
St. Barbara is the patron saint for those in danger of sudden death.
She is the patron saint of all artillerists. For you, we have your very own Medal of St. Barbara. She protects us and watches over us. Advance cartridge. Charge with cartridge. Ram down cartridge. Prepare to fire. Fire!
If you want to own your own piece of American history, where do you start? First, learn everything you can about the type of item you'd like to collect. Go to museums, go to antique fairs, talk to dealers and collectors. Study books, price guides, and antique magazines. You can also give yourself a leg up by joining a collecting club. These are great places to network with other collectors. You can benefit from their experiences and, of course, learn from their mistakes. Once you decide to buy an artifact, how do you proceed? First, only buy from reputable vendors. Regardless of how reputable the dealer is, always ask for a money-back guarantee. There's always the chance you've bought a forgery or a fake. It can happen to the best of us. If you suspect you have, get an appraisal or a second opinion. Once you have some proof of fakery, take the object back to the dealer you bought it from. Reputable ones will always take back a fake. And if you've got a guarantee, you'll get your money back. Finally, remember that those unbelievable diamond-in-the-rough finds make for great movie plots, but they don't exist too often in the real world. If it's too good a deal to be true, it probably isn't.
Watch out the detectives. Get so angry when the teardrops start, but you can't move it 'cause you got no heart. Watch out the detectives. It's just like watching the detectives.